This week on Viral History, we sit down with author and historian Tom Holland to discuss his fascination with the ancient world, filmed at the fantastic Chalke Valley History Festival.
My name's Tom Holland. I'm a historian of antiquity and the early Middle Ages, and my involvement with the Chalke Valley History Festival is that my brother was a co-founder of it, and I'm a trustee of it, and I grew up in the village where it is currently taking place, so it's slightly odd for me to look at fields that had only ever been full of cows and see it full of tents and cars. I was doing a doctorate on Byron and ancient Greek literature, and I was chiefly doing that because I wanted to be a great novelist. I wanted to be Proust, essentially, and I had to be honest with myself. I had to face up to the fact that I probably wasn't the new Proust. So I had this idea that I would, while I was doing this doctorate on Byron, that actually I couldn't get to grips with what made him tick, and then I suddenly thought about writing a book in which he was literally a vampire, because Byron kind of provided the model for the vampire that haunts our imaginings now. And I got signed up on the back of that to do 3 more, and it had never really been a part of my plan to write vampire fiction. But because history was my preeminent interest, all these various novels were set in different periods of history. And the last one was a vampire novel set in 3 different periods. It was kind of like a Russian doll, different period within different period within different period. One of which was Howard Carter discovering Tutankhamun's tomb. Another was in the Fatimid period of the Arabian Nights, if you like, and then the final one was the age of Tutankhamun, and more saliently Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, who in my retelling of the story was in fact inevitably a vampire. And I put in so much research into this, and I was so proud of myself for having conclusively proved that the 18th dynasty pharaohs were all vampires. And I thought, wow, people are going to be so impressed by this. And of course it came out, and unsurprisingly, historians of Egypt don't tend to read vampire novels, and so nobody really paid any attention to it. But I realised on the back of that I actually found the fact far more interesting than the fiction, and really I decided that the reality of Akhenaten and the 18th dynasty was far more interesting than anything that I could add to it. And so I decided from that point on that I wanted to write straight history rather than kind of chucking weird supernatural stuff in. I mentioned Proust, and of course the great theme of Proust is that he bites on the Madeleine dipped in tea, and he's transported back to his childhood, and in a sense the whole novel is about an attempt to get in touch with his past. And I realise now that it took me time to understand what my childhood passions were, and I realised that it wasn't really the stuff of fiction, it was the stuff of history. Here we are in this spot. I would come here and go looking for, there was supposed to be a ghost of a Roman centurion here, and I realised that is the kind of, it was the sense of mystery and excitement and indeed danger that I always felt around history from my childhood that actually would motivate and inspire me as an adult writer. And it took me, I guess, about a decade to realise that I'd been working in the wrong genre. And that often happens, that if you're a writer, it can take you time to work out what you actually want to do. The first book I wrote was called Rubicon, and as the name suggests, it's about the collapse of the Roman Republic, which was precipitated by Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, and I wanted to tell it essentially as a kind of psychodrama about what made the Romans of the late Republic tick. And so in a sense it was a biography of the Republic itself, which was this extraordinary state which had conquered much of the Mediterranean and beyond. It had channeled a ferocious meritocratic urge to conquer among its individual citizens, but had somehow managed to streamline them so that it didn't turn in on itself, so that all those energies were projected outwards. But then in the final decades of the Republic, that all went wrong, and the great men of Rome began to turn on one another, and Caesar, of course, was the last and the greatest who did that. So that was my ambition, I I don't think I've ever enjoyed writing anything as much. There was a kind of sense of, at last I've come home, at last this is what I want to be doing. And I finished with the rise to power of Augustus, who was Julius Caesar's adopted son, great-nephew, who then established a line of emperors that lasted right the way up to the fall of Rome. And it was an obvious sequel to cover the first dynasty of the Caesars, the family of Augustus. And that was on hold really for 10, 11, 12 years after I finished Rubicon. But finally I got the green light from my editor to do that. And so Dynasty is the sequel, or I should say Dynasty, or Dynasty even, because it's a very bloody and carnivorous tale of ambition. So here in the Chalke Valley, every year I have, for an hour, given a talk that is aimed at children that originally had been telling the stories of the Greek heroes. So I did Odysseus, Perseus, Theseus, Heracles, Jason, and I've now essentially run out of Greek heroes. So I'm thinking, who else should I do? So I thought, well, I'll do King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So this afternoon will be my first attempt to do that. I've no idea how it's going to go. Well, I mean, if you're asking me, do I think King Arthur existed? No, I don't think King Arthur existed. But the stories that are told about him are absolutely the stuff of history, because the tales of the Knights of the Round Table was the stuff of high culture, in literary culture in the Middle Ages, and has remained part of our tradition right the way through the Victorian period. You think of Tennyson into the present era. So in a sense, King Arthur's Knights are the British equivalent of the Greek heroes of myth. The period that I've most written about, which is the ancient world, I think the appeal is essentially that of very good science fiction. What good science fiction does is that it gives you a sense simultaneously of a world that is familiar and yet utterly strange, and it's the mingling of those two things that in a sense generate the interest. I think you get that particularly perhaps with the Romans, but with all ancient peoples, that there are ways of looking at them where they do seem familiar. You know, you could imagine, yes, this is how I would respond, and then suddenly you think, no, these people are totally strange. They're terrifyingly strange, and there's a sense in which there's a kind of chasm that separates us, I think, from antiquity that is very profound. And in a sense, I guess that the fascination is the attempt to try and bridge that chasm. What happened in the past determines the way that we understand the present and the future, and you can see that very clearly over the course of the past few years. We've had two seismic referendums in this country, one on the future of Scotland, should it be independent, one, of course, on should Britain stay in the European Union. Both of those debates essentially were debates about history. They were about how the Scots interpreted their past and about how the British interpreted their past, and whether you wanted to stay in or to leave the European Union chiefly depended on how you understood Britain's relationship with the continent. So I think that history crucially informs the way that we function politically, socially, culturally, and economically. But on top of that, the value of history is simply that it is interesting. And the ultimate meaning of history, it's a Greek word, it derives from, it essentially means inquiry, it means research. And the first historian, Herodotus, whose account was the first great classic that I loved, I read it when I was 12, I translated it for Penguin Classics, I've lived with it pretty much all my life. The thing about Herodotus is that he is curious about everything. He wants to know everything about everything. And I think that is what history ultimately is about. It's about our desire to know. It's about our desire to understand. It's about our recognition that essentially there is nothing human that is not of interest. And whether in the past you find things that are familiar or alien, the fascination remains constant. I remember I got given a book. It was called The Greek Armies. It was written and illustrated by a guy called Peter Connolly, who had a very detailed knowledge of Greek armour, and he did these kind of wonderful, wonderfully vivid illustrations. And there was one of the Spartans at Thermopylae, and I became very obsessed by the story of the Persian invasions of Greece as a result of that. And I realised Herodotus is basically our main source for that. And I remember going to the library, and it was in the adult section, and I felt quite intimidated by that. Came in 2 volumes, pulled it off. The first volume, got stuck in, wanted to read about the Battle of Thermopylae. There was nothing about the Battle of Thermopylae. It was full of kind of weird stuff about a man demanding that another man watches his wife naked, and then I think, what? And then there's a guy who jumps off a ship and lands on a dolphin, and then there's a whole load of stuff about the Egyptians and how Egyptian men pee sitting down and Egyptian women pee standing up. I was kind of thinking, what? I don't want this, I want the Battle of Thermopylae. And then finally in the second half I got to all that kind of stuff. Over the course of my life I realised that actually it wasn't so much the Battle of Thermopylae that it was interesting, it was all the weird stuff in volume 1, and I wish that there was more of that. So Herodotus has been the great companion of my reading life, I guess. The other there's another book that 2 other books that really made me want to write history. One is a book by a woman called Barbara Tuchman called A Distant Mirror. Barbara Tuchman was, she was not an academic, but she wrote a definitive book of the outbreak of the First World War. That was her specialisation, but she then wanted to investigate the 14th century and see whether the impact of the Black Death had been analogous to that of the First World War. But the project spiralled out, and it ended up, she wrote this book that was an entire study of the 14th century called A Distant Mirror. And again, I must have read that 20, 30 times. I mean, I loved it. I loved it more than any novel, and it remains a great inspiration to me. And then there was a book called, which I read when I was struggling with my ambition to be Proust. And it was called From Alexander to Actium, and I got it off a public library in London. It goes from Alexander the Great up to the defeat of Cleopatra by the Romans, and essentially it's a period we call Hellenistic era. And it again opened my eyes to how fascinating the scholarly history of the classical world could be. So those 3 books essentially have been, I guess, the 3 greatest influences on me. My career path was a bit of a slalom. I was going off-piste all over the place, and it took me time, until I guess I was early 30s before I realised that actually what I wanted to do was to write history. The advice that I would give to any writer, whether of fiction or of non-fiction, is essentially to try and be as close to human blotting paper as you possibly can be, to soak up everything that interests you. The great thing about being a novelist is that, even if you're having a terrible time, even if you're getting dumped, even if you've lost your job, it's all grist of the mill. You'll still be able to use it. If you want to be a historian, then just pander to your fascination with the past. There is no aspect of the past that may not serve to help and inform your study of it.